Well, good afternoon. Welcome to another IDB webinar. Today's subject is Understanding Megacities, Urban Elephants on Steroids. I'm Ted Brewer, Senior Vice President of the IDB, and it's my pleasure to host and moderate this event today. We also have behind the scenes Christina Nadeau and Sabrina Warner producing the event. We want to thank you for taking your valuable time this afternoon and joining us, and we think you'll get a lot out of this discussion, especially considering the caliber of our panelists. Just a few ground rules before we start. I will first ask each panelist for their view on megacities. After we do that, discussion will surely ensue, and we will take Q&A questions from you via Zoom from the audience. In addition, we'll record the session and you'll be able to get access to that after the webinar. Let's begin. Tokyo, Kinshasa, Sao Paulo, Shanghai, Seoul, New York. These are examples of the 33 urban agglomerations, better known as megacities, on the planet today. Defined by the UN as cities with 10 million or more, these dense urban environments are expected to increase to 43 in number by 2030. They are indeed elephants on the world stage. The impact of megacities goes well beyond their size. They present extraordinary capabilities, opportunities, as well as huge complex challenges to the people who live in them, interact with them, and try to govern them. We must give them more consideration and all due respect as we engage with and plan for future operations in megacities. Army Chiefs of Staff have recognized the very high possibility of future engagements in megacities. General Milley put it all on the table at an AUSA conference, noting, quote, "We need to man, organize, train, and equip the force for operations in urban areas, highly dense urban areas, and that's a different construct. We're not organized like that right now." I think that's quite the admission. Today, hopefully, we will heed General Milley's challenge and advance the cause across the spectrum of governance to gain a better understanding of megacities so we can take actions now to avoid catastrophe, not if, but when we have to engage. To help us get us arms around this mega issue, the IDB has assembled a phenomenal panel of experts. These leaders have all served their country for decades and bring a wealth of experience to this video table. First, General Vincent Brooks. General Brooks is a former commander of United States Forces Korea, United Nations Command, and ROK, U.S. Combined Forces Command, and previously the commanding general of U.S. Army Pacific. He is a principal with West Exec Advisors, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, serves on several boards, and a senior distinguished and executive fellow at Harvard, the University of Texas, and the IDB, respectively. Next, Ambassador Johnny Carson is a retired Foreign Service officer who has served as United States Ambassador to several African nations. He also served as U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and is currently a senior advisor at the Albright Stonebridge Group and the United States Institute for Peace. Colonel Patrick Mahaney is a Special Forces officer who served as Director of the Chief of Staff of the Army Strategic Studies Group. A military fellow at the member and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, he has held a range of combat command and operational assignments. He is currently the director and co-founder of the National Center for Urban Operations. Colonel Mahaney is also an adjunct professor of international and public affairs at Columbia University and an honorary Fire Department of the City of New York chief. Welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for joining the panel today. We'll begin by going to each of you for your insights on megacities, and I think this will go a long way in understanding these dense urban elephants on steroids. General Brooks, if you could take it away, sir.
All right, Ted, thanks so much for the introduction and for the honor of being on this panel with Ambassador Johnny Carson and Colonel Pat Mahaney. I look forward to the dialogue that will come out here. You know, we were supposed to do this in person a few months back in the city of New York, a dense city, you know, certainly our largest, but not the largest in the world by a long shot. And the effects of urbanization, dense urbanization manifested when a pandemic hits a large urban area. You see the kinds of things that happen in this particular case. So it was while we didn't physically meet, it was probably a pretty good example of the kinds of considerations that come with dense urbanization. So let me just share a couple thoughts. You know, I've had the opportunity to touch personally, either through visiting or through engaging with militaries in many of the countries that have truly dense megacities, orders of magnitude larger than New York City, or denser is probably the right way to describe it. And I was just writing a short list of myself of New Delhi, Dhaka, Kathmandu, Manila, Jakarta, Singapore, Seoul, Beijing, Bogota, Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Kyoto, Sapporo, all these places I've been. And in many cases, for military reasons, I've been there. Clearly, as my last assignment in Korea manifested to me, when we had the potential of armed conflict erupting and emerging again on the Korean Peninsula, we couldn't help but think about the city of Seoul, and to a lesser degree, another dense city, Pyongyang, but especially the dense city of Seoul, twice the density of New York City, and what it means. And so there are a number of considerations that come into mind, and I'll race across a few of these, because I'm sure my colleagues will touch on them as well. There are public policy implications of dense urbanized areas. There seems to be a bit of a progressive trend in densely urbanized areas, and even in some cases, like in Khartoum, Sudan, overthrowing of autocracies in dense urbanized areas. So this progressiveness seems to be a dynamic that we witness in many cities around the world in this category. There are public health issues. I've already alluded to what happens when a pandemic hits a densely urbanized area. That could also happen with other things that lead to complex medical problems, complex response problems. Many a day that I spend in Dhaka, Bangladesh, working with the Bangladesh military on how to respond to cyclones and earthquakes, as both of them could affect them, and even other disasters like a fire inside of a textile building with multiple floors that killed hundreds of people and changed their way of thinking about disaster response. So these are public policy and public health concerns that are fairly significant, and disaster response concerns, as densely urbanized areas make it much more complex to respond. We saw that in New York City on 9/11/2001, but many others have seen this for lots of reasons. Certainly after the earthquakes that happened in Japan, on their 3/11, as they call it, it opened our eyes, I think, globally to what happens in densely urbanized areas when a natural disaster hits. Let me talk in my final point here about military considerations in these areas. And as General Milley highlighted, we have to train, organize, and equip for that. We have to develop leaders who understand it. And that is a fundamental change. Our practice over time militarily, and particularly in the United States Army, which is the primary one that has to physically engage cities, is to bypass an urban area and find ways to engage the enemy or draw the enemy out of the urban area if possible, make it so it's no longer relevant. In some cases, it's to declare it a non-hostile area and try to get both combatants to come out of there, as was the case in Manila in 1944 and 1945. It ultimately ended up that the Japanese continued to defend in Manila, and Manila ended up getting largely destroyed because of that. So when you have the military considerations of war in densely urbanized area, you fundamentally begin to bump up against things like the law of war. What is a legitimate target? What is not? You find that your training has been impacted by being accustomed to scanning for your enemy on a horizontal plane, for example, and not having to take into account subterranean structures or super elevated buildings where you're now having to look in almost a 360-degree sphere to be able to identify the enemy and to address it. The use of precision guided munitions, it becomes much more complicated inside of a city. Yes, it is possible for us to fly a cruise missile down a highway or down a street inside of a densely urbanized area, but to get the exactly right attack angle into the 27th floor of a building can be challenging, as I saw in downtown Baghdad, as we used precision munition to eliminate a sniper there when I was serving there. The types of equipment that one would need, we practiced quite a bit in Korea about what happens when you're in a tunnel, because there would certainly be tunnels in and through the demilitarized zone area, deeper into North Korea, behind the demilitarized zone, and under the city of Pyongyang itself. Extensive tunnel networks. What happens to your electronic signals when you're inside of there? How do you communicate that you need help because you're now in contact inside of a tunnel? How do your robots communicate with the controlling unit once they've gone around two corners inside of a tunnel? And the answer is they don't. And so the technologies that are associated with operating in urbanized areas are significantly different and require a completely different approach and a very, very different mindset. I've never felt more isolated than inside of a very large city in Baghdad and the high structures around us, where people had been largely evacuated because of combat action. And all of it is in ruins, and the enemy can be in any particular spot. That's a very lonely feeling in a very large place. And so there's a psychology that comes with urbanized operations as well that cannot be underestimated, and what comes from that. Finally, the cyber effects that can happen in a city deliberately applied by an adversary to disrupt a major dense area for lots of reasons, to create a crisis in governance, to use it as an obstacle, to incite unrest among civilians, to make military operations complex. That's a very, very large danger right now. And in some cities there is hardening, but in most cities around the world, there is not sufficient hardening. And so it remains a vulnerable target. And then finally, what about water? And so the effect of water on densely urbanized areas, on production, on cleanness, and on what happens if there's a failure in each one of those categories, it leads us to very complex problems. So we'll talk about a lot today, I know. I hope this gets you started, and I look forward to hearing from my colleagues on the panel. So thanks very much, Ted.
Thank you, General. Certainly covered the waterfront there. That gives us a lot to think about. And Ambassador, I believe we can take it over toward Africa now.
Yes, thank you. Let me say thank you, Ted, very much for the nice introduction. And it's a pleasure to be on a panel with General Brooks and also with Colonel Mahaney. And thank you all for allowing me to talk a little bit about urbanization and the growth of African cities. This is an extremely important topic that has not received the kind of attention it really deserves. But I think that any discussion about urbanization in Africa must begin with a few words about one of the central drivers of African urbanization, and that is population growth. Africa is experiencing an enormous population explosion, which could result in a significant demographic dividend or even a demographic disaster, both of which could impact Africa's urban future landscape. Africa has the youngest and the fastest growing population in the world. Over the next 35 years, Africa's population will surge from just over 1 billion people to approximately 2.3 billion people by 2050. Today, 65% of Africa's 1 billion people are under the age of 35, and over 35% are between the ages of 15 and 35. In Nigeria, Africa's most populous country, the population will increase from today's roughly 200 million to just over 400 million, a total that is scheduled to overtake the population of the United States by 2050, making Nigeria, yes, Nigeria, the third most populated country in the world, behind India and China, and just above the United States. To get an understanding of what's happening in Nigeria's population explosion, let me just point to two quick facts. In 1960, when Nigeria gained its independence from Great Britain, England's population was 52 million people. Nigeria's population was 47 million people. Today, England's population is 65 million people. And of course, Nigeria's population is roughly 200 million people and increasing. The other fact worth noting today is that more children are born every day in Nigeria than in the 26 countries that comprise the European Union. That gives you a scope of some of the population growth that is going on. Ethiopia, which is much in the news today, if you were listening to NPR or looking at the New York Times over the weekend, Ethiopia, Africa's second most populated country, is expected to increase its population from just over 90 million to 190 million people between now and 2015. Rapid population growth is being experienced across the continent, not only in the large states like Nigeria and Ethiopia, but many of the smaller states as well. The continent's demographic surge could unleash further economic growth as it did in Asia, or it could, in fact, turn out to be a demographic disaster or certainly a challenge. We cannot predict the economic outcome of what will happen, and we're certainly not saying that all will come out badly. But one thing we know is that Africa's population growth is going to have a significant impact on Africa's urbanization. As Africa's population grows, the continent is becoming increasingly urbanized. The rates of urbanization in Africa are some of the highest in the world. Today, approximately 36% of Africa's population lives in urban areas. But by 2030, more than half of the continent's people will live in major cities. And the growth rate of population in urban areas will be almost twice as fast as that of the general population across the continent. Today in Africa, just as an example, Africa has approximately 11 megacities. Megacities that are defined in excess of 5 million inhabitants. They have 59 urban areas with populations of more than 1 million to people, and 75 cities with populations of 500,000 to 1 million. Overall, the continent has 3,000 cities with populations of more than 25,000 inhabitants. And of course, one of the major changes over the last decade is the fact that Lagos, Nigeria, now has overtaken Cairo as the largest city on the continent. Other African cities like Nairobi, Addis Ababa, Johannesburg, Kinshasa, Dar es Salaam, Luanda, Accra, Algiers, and Abidjan have become sprawling metropolitan cities. Rapid urbanization, as I say, can accelerate economic growth. But this economic growth must be accompanied by better organized cities that generate employment for younger citizens. But rapid urbanization can trigger enormous challenges. Some of them, I think, that General Brooks has already spoken to. We know that they can generate poverty, they can generate higher unemployment, they can generate the need for infrastructure and transportation, for clean water and sanitation, for electricity, better governance, and a need to address some of the major challenges that are new dealing with the problems of environment and climate change. Let me just digress very quickly, and I'll make 2 or 3 other quick points and then stop. One is that large cities in Africa lack the kind of infrastructure and basic service needs that a lot of the urban areas that we think of today. And these are complex areas that are growing very rapidly. They're growing without roads, they're growing without infrastructure, and they are growing largely as spontaneous urban developments. Another word for slums and densely populated areas. These places generally are also very impoverished. They're hard to get in and out of. They're generally lacking in very good street maps and direction finders, but they can also be enormously challenging in other ways. Think of disease and health and what happens if we have Ebola or if we have an AIDS outbreak or if we have some other major disease outbreak such as we're going through right now with COVID-19. How do you get in to provide the humanitarian support? How do you get in to help people deal with these kinds of problems? How do you help them deal with the humanitarian problems that emerge from these kinds of situations? So services and response to services are important. These areas, because of high unemployment and youth who do not have gainful opportunities to work or to go to school, can in fact become security challenges. And again, dealing with them is a major problem in these kinds of environments. Police services, fire services are like health services and environmental services. They tend to be weak in these urban areas. And we've seen some of this. And then finally, there is the overall issue of politics in urban areas. In many African countries, the opposition is in the urban areas. The opposition to political leadership is generally found in urban areas, not in the rural areas where people are generally farming and reasonably satisfied, but in the urban areas where young men and women can't find jobs, where they're close to government and they see the weaknesses of government, they see the excesses of their political leaders, and opposition springs up from these urban areas. General Brooks mentioned recently the situation in Sudan. Just 2 years ago, a popular uprising in urban areas led to the overthrow of General Bashir. And in Nigeria, just 3.5 weeks ago, there was a major round of civil unrest against the police because of police excesses, where the population rose up first in Lagos to protest the excesses of something called SARS, which was the Special Armed Robbery Unit. And urban youth led those protests, which resulted in the burning of police stations, the burning of government buildings, and the destruction of lots of property. Those riots were put down very harshly, not by the police, but by the military. And when the military came in to put them down, they too generated a lot of angst and anger from the population. So there are problems that come up in urban areas. Last, I'll point out climate change is a major problem. If you look at African cities, most of the major cities and some 20 of the 54 African countries around the continent have cities that are on the coast in low-lying areas that were built and established by colonial powers. All of these cities, to one degree or another, are likely to become humanitarian challenges in the future because of rising sea levels and other changes in water and climate conditions. Let me stop there. That's a little bit of the opening.
Thanks, Ambassador. Appreciate the insight. Colonel Mahaney.
Hi, Ted. Good to see you again. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. And
bet.
I would like to highlight it is truly an honor for me to be on this panel with my distinguished colleagues here, General Brooks and Ambassador Carson. And I'd like to thank both of you gentlemen, in fact, for your support for the Dense Urban Studies Strategic Broadening Seminar that we've been able to put together for the Army, because this is a critical topic and we need all the support that we can get to make sure that this effort continues forward. Having said that, greetings from Fort Hamilton, which is in Brooklyn, New York. So I live and work on the only DoD facility here in New York City. So my views, particularly those I'm going to speak about here, are mainly focused on obviously national security and public safety from the perspective of somebody who was born and raised in New York and spent my entire adult life in the United States Army. And I've been fascinated with this problem for a very long time. So let me get right to it. I'm going to basically run through three main points, which cover the challenges or some key challenges of this set. The two main takeaways, which I believe cover opportunities for us in this with regard to this challenge set. And then finally, one big idea, which is frankly a big idea, but I think it's one that's worthy of consideration in terms of outlook and mindset if we're going to properly address the challenges of dealing with dense urban areas and in particular megacities going into the future. So the three main points are very simply complexity, density, and intensity. Again, complexity, density, and intensity. Bit of a mantra I've been using of late. So let me cover them briefly. So complexity, obviously dense urban areas and certainly megacities are extraordinarily complex operational environments. What I mean by complex in this case, or complexity in general, is that so many elements are interconnected in there. You can't have a very simple linear mindset when you come into any large city, let alone megacities. You have to understand that any action is going to have second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth order effects. And sometimes those effects are going to be very hard to predict. To help you understand that, it's a very simple point, but particularly for the military, sometimes it becomes rather challenging. So I'm going to describe it and to kind of wrap our brains around it. So I'm going to use two very simple military models to describe this very briefly, given the time that's available. The first one is what we call multi-domain operations. So the Army has been pushing this conceptual framework for a few years. The other services, I think wisely, have largely come on board with this piece. And what multi-domain operations mean are we have to operate in the domains of land, sea, air, cyber, and space. That, regardless of whether you're in a city or in a jungle, the deserts, mountaintops, whatever, you have to consider all of those domains. I'm going to just focus on two of them. One that's usually overlooked when particularly land forces consider operations in and around large cities, and that's the sea part, or more specifically, the maritime littoral part. That could also include riverine in the case of very large river systems that go through cities. But the point is that the maritime domain, the littoral piece, is often completely overlooked. And yet cities, especially very, very large cities, are almost always closely attached to major bodies of water. And the advantages and challenges of operating in and around the sea, the maritime littoral piece, is almost always forgotten. I'm not referring to, by the way, what General Brooks referred to, which is water as an essential element in and of itself. I'm talking about it as a means of transportation, as a means for commerce, as that sort of thing. And essentially, it is often overlooked. Well, it goes hand in glove with the land component. So right there, where land forces usually forget about that, you've really got to, we have to stay focused on it. So let me cover a few things about the land component. Obviously, people live on the land. And in land operations, for the US military, we have a very simple model, which is, this will be the second model I address, to describe the variables that are at play in an operational environment. It's called they're called the operational variables. The acronym is referred to as PMISI PT. Don't become afraid. I'll explain it very briefly. It's political, military, economic, social, informational, infrastructure, and then -PT, which stands for physical terrain. So my point I would want to make here is that you must consider, for all military operations, across the range of military operations, meaning from humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, through stability operations, peacekeeping, and even up to and including combat, if unfortunately that becomes necessary, you have to consider all those other elements that normally don't come to mind for many military forces. For example, the political, the economic, the social, the information environment, absolutely critical, and the infrastructure. which gets to how the societies sustain themselves, either physically, as in the case of aqueducts or the provision of water, for example, or it could be information infrastructure such as cell phone towers. But the point is that you can't turn your back on them. You have to specifically focus on them to be able to operate in the land domain in that piece. In the interest of time, I'll move on. The M in PMEZ PT, the military. In the case of the military piece, we normally think of, not surprisingly, the military would be the joint services of the United States together with the militaries of our allies and partners. So what we would call the joint combined environment. What I would submit to you is that that concept of forces of security, forces of order, absolutely is insufficient for the types of operations we're talking about in megacities or very large cities. That what we consider as an M of the military forces has got to include such elements as first responders, so police, fire, emergency medical services. It has to include, I would submit to you, non-governmental organizations who provide relief. In some cases, the NGOs provide emergency medical service. Not all EMS services are from the government. In many cases, they're community-based organizations or what have you. There's international organizations. My point here is that the operational forces, which we normally conceive of as being military, going into a military operation, the definition has got to be expanded out, or at least the understanding of everybody else at play in those environments has really got to be expanded out. And again, that speaks to my point about complexity. The dash PT, the physical terrain, General Brooks hit on this, which when he talked about being in Baghdad. So essentially cities usually grow on the surface and then they go subsurface with starting with basements and in many cases tunnels and things of that nature, and then up. In New York City, we live with a very strong subterranean component. Most of us know it as the subway systems, for example, but there's so many other tunnels, utility tunnels, sewer tunnels, viaducts, aqueducts, there's all kinds of that. And that is pretty standard across the world. And of course, then you've got the high end, the positive end of what we call the Z-axis, the vertical going up. In the case of New York, there used to be 6-story buildings was the big limit. Then it moved to buildings that were 20, 30, 40 stories. And now, of course, we're up around 100. And we've got bigger and bigger buildings going on. So you can't just choose one to operate in. You have to be able to use all of them. Again, to my point, this is a very complex operating environment that we have to get used to. Okay, moving on. That was complexity. So with density, I'll briefly cover this. In density, we're talking about density of structures, people, the electromagnetic spectrum. It's all of that. It's all compressed into one particular area. In the case of the US Army, for example, very often I deal with people from Fort Benning, Georgia, who consider, and for good reason, Atlanta to be a very big and dense city. Well, Atlanta's population density is about 3,000 people per square mile. We then bring them up to places like where I am right now, Brooklyn, which is about 37,000 people per square mile, right? So 12 times the density of a major global city, Atlanta. We then cross over into Manhattan, and we're looking at about 70,000 people per square mile, with neighborhoods like Chinatown, for example, pushing upwards of 80 and even higher than that, right? So you're talking about roughly 30 times the density of people and structures and a very jammed up electromagnetic spectrum that is right there. So you have to be able to consider all of that. Quick note on that. There's a saying in the military that quantity sometimes has a quality of its own. I would submit to you that that argument that sometimes the density is as represented by measurable quantities has something of a quality of its own, and we have to consider it when we look at this. Intensity. So I would focus on scale to start that, and then I would touch on a concept I call strategic compression. It's referred to as strategic compression. In terms of scale, in terms of density, essentially imagine taking any operational force, we'll talk about ground forces of the US, for example, together with their riverine littoral components, and you put them into an environment like New York or Lagos, Nigeria, or some other very major city. They're used to thinking of things within certain bounded limits in some way, shape, or form. In this case, it's just so expansive. In the case of New York City, most cities in the United States, for example, have a city inside of a county. We have a city made up of 5 counties here and another 6 immediately adjacent to us. So really the metropolitan area of New York City is not just the 5 boroughs of New York City, each of which is a county. There's 11 counties, and that's just the immediate surrounding areas. The tri-state area is even further out than that. So I'm bringing this up because of the point about scale, that in and of itself, that can be a truly remarkable thing that creates a sense of intensity for our people. Intensity in terms of what? the drains on our resources, on our cognitive load, even in some cases the psychology for our troops, our leaders, of having to deal with something so extraordinary is really quite intense. Sticking with the concept of intensity, I'd quickly point out the concept of strategic compression. All megacities certainly are of tremendous importance in terms of economics and politics, and in the global connected web of trade, commerce, etc. So they're extraordinarily important, which means they're strategic. We don't always think of cities as being strategic, but certainly these large cities are very strategic. So in the military, we tend to think of strategic, operational, and tactical as three separate levels. And there's a good reason for that, why we try to make this intelligible and allow us to be able to deal with it. But my point is that in these cities, if you're conducting operations there, you have strategic compression. So you're operating at a strategic level, an operational level, and a tactical level, sometimes simultaneously. It's a concept that the Marine Corps' General Krulak back in the 90s had pointed out. He referred to the strategic corporal. In the interest of time, I won't go into it too much, but you can imagine the intensity for that strategic corporal who is operating block to block to block, or floor to floor to floor, above ground, below ground, but they're part of what may be a major operational play in an area of just the neighborhood. And it is of strategic import. That's pretty intense. Moving on, the two takeaways, very simple. They're innovation and collaboration. And so these are opportunities for us to take advantage of. And innovation, as General Brooks correctly pointed out, in many cases, you'll find that the gear that certainly military forces has been issued is very good gear, but it doesn't work necessarily in the environments we're talking about, certainly not subterranean. I would also point out in many high-rise environments and in the canyons of concrete and steel, a lot of our stuff just doesn't work. Using FM line-of-sight radios is a great example. We need a lot more mesh networks, et cetera, to do that. So we have to be able to innovate in this. My role in the Department of Defense, I'm a senior advisor with the Defense Innovation Unit's National Security Innovation Network. And the good news here is not just us, but certainly my organization working very hard in this place. And given that who's hosting this is the Institute of Business, I would say it's an opportunity for both the defense side to get better in terms of material development and also tactics, techniques, and procedures for operating in this environment, but also for business. And in this case, a lot of the businesses that benefit are small tech innovator companies that are in tech ecosystems such as, certainly New York City, but also Austin, Boston, et cetera, places throughout the world, because a lot of these challenges we're trying to innovate for are the types of things that fit into those technological challenges. I'm not referring to large platforms such as helicopters or tanks or that sort of thing. I'm referring to and I'd be happy to answer this in questions, about the host of other things that truly enable our troops and enhance national security and public safety. Finally, collaboration. We have got to be able to collaborate inside the city we're operating in, no matter where it is around the world. And I would argue that we have to continue to collaborate with our partners, even in our own country here, to better understand how to face these challenges. Essentially, we've got to forge the critical linkages, which I would point out that we've been doing for a while, but we can always get better at it and expand this out. We have to forge the critical linkages for those people who understand these environments, who operate and live in them all the time, that are very much willing to deal with us, certainly in the Department of Defense. And I'd say that would go a long way towards helping our survivability and effectiveness. The big idea, final point. If what I've just pointed out is true or largely true, I would argue that we are facing potentially what I would call a new heroic age. I'm contrasting that with the idea of a post-heroic age, pointed out by scholars such as Edward Luttwak back in the 90s and as late as 2007. The idea of being a revolution in military affairs had fundamentally changed the way militaries would do operations. There's a strong case for that to be made in certain areas, but I would say when you're talking about megacities, dense urban environments, it's not. Because in order to face the complexity I pointed out, to deal with the density, to stand up to the intensity of these types of challenges, we've got to have the human capital, the talent, the people, flesh and blood human beings, in uniform, not in uniform, who are going to go into these environments and go face to face with the inhabitants, trying to help them. But also there may be threats that are very difficult to discern. It takes courage. It takes physical and moral courage to be able to do that in a way that would make our country proud. And so what I would say is this type of challenge, which is really fascinating to work on, is frankly exciting to work on, that it may represent a move towards what I would consider a new heroic age. And if anybody would like to challenge me on that, I'd be happy to answer a question and answer. Having said that, Ted, thank you very much. And I'll put myself on mute.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Well, as we've seen from our three panelists, this is indeed a huge elephant-like complex subject. We basically cover the waterfront, and the words whole of nation come up, as well as many other degrees of operations in these cities. So we've been having the questions flow in. I've been trying to field them and listen to Colonel Haney at the same time. And I'll tell you, that's information overload for me. But great information from all of you. Thank you very much. And I'll neck it down a little bit to get to some specific questions. There was question, Ambassador Carson, for you, asking what the greatest challenge to HR responses in Africa would be. And as Colonel Mahaney pointed out, and General Brooks, we operate across the entire spectrum here, and HR is certainly one of those we would employ in a megacity.
Am I on? Yeah, I'm not sure what you are defining as HR.
Humanitarian relief, sorry.
Okay. I just want
military term.
No, it's humanitarian relief, but it's also human resource. It can
That's
be
true.
human resources.
We hope we're not going to be with HR today on that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and there are a couple of others that could be defined in HR as well. That's why I wanted to. Humanitarian relief is going to be focused, I think, largely around meeting health pandemics and other kinds of natural disasters. I think urban areas are particularly vulnerable to outbreaks of disease. Some of those things can be localized, but as we are finding out over the last couple of decades, that there are a dozen different kinds of hemorrhagic fevers that can spread globally very quickly, and that it is in our interest to help respond to pandemics, humanitarian crises quickly overseas, so that they do not become global problems and they do not, in some instances, become regional problems, or they don't incapacitate nations. But I would say health pandemics, I think climate emergencies are there. I think one of the things that we haven't looked at very closely with respect to Africa is the environmental challenges that are out there. We've seen enormous climate problems in our own country, fires on the West Coast, storms in the West and the Southwest. But Africa has been having these climate humanitarian problems as well. And I think immigration and movement of people as a result of conflict.
Thank you, Ambassador. Appreciate that. General Brooks, it looks like we have somebody that used to work for you, and they are wondering what your thoughts are on the role civil affairs should play before, during, and after a conflict in megacities.
Yeah, thanks, Ted. I saw the question from Chris Stockel, who's
yes,
a great thinker and also a civil affairs general, as well as a strong businessman. So he and I have talked about this many times, and I would just share a few thoughts very quickly, that the civil affairs units that exist can provide a tremendous amount of depth in understanding environments like this. The Army Reserve is the place where most of them are found. And when committed, they bring experiences with running large cities. Some of them have been city managers or are running parts of the system of a given city, for example. Some of them have experiences beyond that in other areas as well. So there's a tremendous depth of knowledge that happens when U.S. Army Reserve civil affairs units are committed. But the roles that can be played really run a wide spectrum. And as it regards mega cities, it can be things like cooperation with disaster response organizations in advance to help them think through how they protect populations, move them out of the way of a danger that has emerged, a burning building that has collapsed, an earthquake, a inundated area from rising waters, all the things we've talked about. Civil Affairs has experience with that, and partnering with response organizations who may or may not be military in a given country is one of the ways that they can engage in cooperation. They clearly engage during times of competition, especially to help shape the mentalities of a given region through some application of military soft power, often in concert with the Department of State and the Agency for International Development. So a role there as well. In conflict, they're critically important, especially in helping to manage the civilian populations that are exposed to war and to danger. An extraordinarily complex task in a megacity where the density of displaced persons can become immediately overwhelming. Just a few blocks of a major urbanized area, like within 1 square mile, in one of these top 50 cities, it has 75,000 or more in 1 square mile. The effect of that alone can overwhelm any system that is intended to try to protect people from the harm of war. And then, of course, they have a role in trailing combat action to try to restore some degree of normalcy in the absence of government until government can take over for that. And then that carries over into post-conflict conditions, as well, as I certainly experienced in both Kosovo and in Iraq, in Baghdad especially, closely working with civil affairs units and all this. A wide array, a very agile player, but difficult to access because they're in the Army Reserve. And we tend not to see these types of things in cooperation and competition as worthy of mobilizing forces who would otherwise be reserved for times of war. Thanks.
Yes, sir. And Colonel Mahaney, I think this one's right up your alley, as you are an honorary fire chief. I'll kind of flip the question a little bit, but the question was, how can the military incorporate training for first responders into training and operations? Of course, I think you might say from the other perspective as well, how can first responders incorporate the military into their training? So take it away.
Yes, thanks, Ted, and thank you for the question. I would say that we have begun doing that, and we began that a number of years ago, principally in 24 here in New York City, at least. It's been going on quietly for years, but definitely more officially since 2014 and in 2015. When I say officially, I mean established memoranda of understanding, MOUs, between the New York City Fire Department and very recently, in fact, with the for not training, but for testing and evaluation, experimentation with equipment that is relevant to these types of environments with the law enforcement community, specifically the NYPD here. So my point here is that while we have to be clearly respectful of laws, customs, etc., there is an enormous amount of work that we can do, and we are in fact doing with them. As General Brooks had pointed out, the subterranean effort in 2012, that was when the subterranean effort started to really gain some traction. And when it became an issue for General Odierno, who was Chief of Staff of the Army at the time, and General Cohn, who was Commanding General of TRADOC, we went to work directly with the New York City Fire Department, the FDNY, because they're underground all the time in response capacities, wearing self-contained breathing apparatus in a hazmat laden environment, dealing with things that we really rarely go into. So I would say that in particular with key enablers such as hazmat in the environment, such as high rises in subterranean environments and the rest, we've done a fair amount of that. Now the question is it going to continue, and can we scale it out a little bit more? I think we need to. Certainly those, as I mentioned earlier, forge the critical linkages. Those linkages are already forged, at least certainly here in the New York City metropolitan area, and also with other key elements around the United States. It's a matter of, are we going to stick with it? Because very often the military, and some of this is understandable, focuses on a thing. It may be the urban piece, it may be a subterranean piece, it may be whatever element of multi-domain operations, and then it moves on to something else. And so the key here is you've got to have at least a few people, a small element tied in to the, in this case, the first responders, and to training and doctrine command for the Army and the similar aspects with the Marine Corps and Special Operations community to do this. Final note is, we actually have right now in New York a dense urban terrain detachment currently sponsored by Asymmetric Warfare Group, which is very small, but we've got the right people. They're National Guardsmen who've been activated. Currently there's one. The bad news is we're down to just one person doing this. That's the bad news. The good news is it's the right person. because of his civilian job, because of his being lieutenant colonel of the infantry in the New York Army National Guard, we have the right person to at least keep alive those relationships and stay focused on a lot of these challenges. And when units come in and are interested in coming in, for example, the 75th Ranger Regiment, 7th Special Forces Group, we've had the 506th Infantry from the 101st come in, and other units that cycle through, we're able to get that going. I would strongly urge the Headquarters Department of the Army and the DoD to create a small, very small school center of some sort, very small, in a place like Fort Hamilton, which is small to begin with, but you could get a lot of bang for your buck in a place like this. And I think if you rely on the reserve components as well as the active components, you'd be able to do a lot of good things to keep this type of goodness going. Thank you.
Thanks, Colonel. I've got a lot of good questions out there, so I'm going to try to get one that hits across all of your all's expertise. A pretty broad question, but it's a pretty good one. Could you discuss, everybody and anybody on the panel, the areas you think we are least prepared for to operate and engage with in megacities? If you could pick one, that would be wonderful. General, Ambassador, Colonel?
I'll let the ambassador go first. He didn't get to comment on the last one.
The greatest challenge, I think, is not having a sufficient understanding of the overseas terrain in which we are going to be engaged. I think we've all alluded to it very briefly, but understanding the environment in which we're operating. I know that Africa Command out of Stuttgart does an extraordinarily good job of having people on the continent, but having a larger number of people who are aware of the mega cities themselves, and knowing the players on the ground who are going to be their partners and collaborators in dealing with problems. That means greater work in interaction with embassies, with USAID, with offices of the Centers for Disease Control, knowing about the immigration and health authorities that are in these places, and just having a better understanding of the teamwork that is necessary whenever you go into an environment. Obviously, every disaster response is not going to be one that is kinetic, but it may be one that requires a large number of American military personnel. I think of places like Liberia and the Ebola outbreak, where in fact, I think military units were sent down from Vicenza, Italy into Liberia to help initially set up hospitals in response to the Ebola crisis there. So it is in fact getting a better understanding, having a better understanding of the complexity of these issues. I might add that while it's important to know the urban environment in the United States, maybe it's important as a part of the training to have U.S. military and security personnel do and look at urban density problems in different parts of the world. Because I would argue that issues of urban density in a place like Lagos, Nigeria, or Kinshasa, the DRC, or in Johannesburg, are strikingly different from the urban density problems that one might find in Sao Paulo, Brazil, or in areas like Seoul, Korea, for example. And so having a better understanding of who you have to operate with, what is available to operate with, and having better associations with embassy country teams, and being aware of the local capacity of officials and knowing them and how they are operating is key to all of this.
Thanks, Ambassador. General?
Yeah, those are all excellent points, and I certainly agree with all of them. I think that the knowledge of the environment is a very important part of this. This is the role, especially for the combatant commands who are out there in the away games of the United States military. So they're already engaged with the megacities of the world, most of which are not in the United States, even on our best day in New York City. So it's elsewhere that we find these things, whether it's in U.S. Army South, like in Sao Paulo, or I'm sorry, U.S. Southern Command, as we see in Sao Paulo, or 4 out of the top 15 cities are all in India. And so our relationships with the countries that have the megacities becomes very important in building some degree of knowledge. I walked the streets of Kathmandu about a year or so before the 2015 earthquake, and I saw how the buildings had been violating their building code. They had building code, but they simply weren't enforcing it. So they had buildings that were cantilevered, literally approaching each other above a street, leaning into the street, with one family unit being stacked on top of another on a liquefaction zone. So geologically, it's sitting on something like a bowl of jello that's going to move when the earth shakes, which it does all the time in the high plains there of Nepal, at the base of the Himalayas. And so it was very clear to me that I began to get an appreciation for the environment there and the kind of help that they would need from U.S. Army Pacific and from U.S. Pacific Command and the Joint Response. And indeed, about a year later, that earthquake that we were all hoping we would never see came. Thankfully, it happened in such a way that didn't create nearly as much death and destruction as it could have, but it affected India, Nepal, and China particularly, and required a multinational response that was far bigger than just the city of Kathmandu in that case. So this is what comes with familiarity of the environment, a recognition of how to spring into action, at least to help the partner, the ally, whichever it should happen to be, to deal with a problem when their own families may be under rubble, which is not always understood. When a disaster happens, whether it is war or a natural disaster unexpectedly, then the people who have to deal with it are also in the midst of that crisis. And so how you respond and through what relationships and whether or not you've had a chance to practice those relationships is critically important. And thankfully, we had quite a bit of practice with the Nepalese military, and it went a long way toward organizing their response in a very short number of days when their own headquarters was destroyed. And so things like this are really important. The last thing I would say, in addition to the knowledge of the environment and the practice that comes in the environment, is the refinement of tactics, techniques, procedures, and technologies. The best way to get there is from the first two. So you need to know what's happening in the area where you might be committed. You need to practice inside of that area. And in doing so, you'll realize my radio doesn't work. I can't get more than 3 blocks. I can't transmit through walls. I can't sense what's happening. My great satellite constellation above me is meaningless when I'm under the ground. All these other things become very clear, and it helps to generate from the bottom up through operational need statements and joint operational need statements, that which is actually required. They're very important. So the more we're out there, the more we learn, the more we come home and keep the troops rested, the less we'll know and the less effective we'll be when we engage the environment in a crisis. Food for thought.
Thank you, sir. Well, Colonel, looks like the General and the Ambassador left you about 30 seconds. So if you'd like, Colonel Maney.
Sure, Ted. I first of all endorse the comments from both the General and the Ambassador. I would highlight that places, global cities, whether it's New York or Lagos or anything, a lot of times they network with each other. So there are many times, although we don't necessarily see it at the federal level, for example, in the Department of Defense, cities are dealing with cities to solve cities' problems, and tapping into that is critical. I'll give you one quick one that's specific to the question: is situational awareness in a confined space area is a challenge that everybody's got, whether you're in whatever type of city, however you want to classify it. I would just end my comment with something a little bit outside of the operational and tactical realm, which is economics. One of the biggest problems, if you're in a city, you can't escape economics. Some of that's intuitive, some of that is not. But we include the E in PMEZ PT and all of our acronyms, the economics piece. But honestly, there's very little understanding about that. And I think that people really have to understand that economics speaks to the lifeblood of a city, how everything really operates. And I think it's given short shrift, generally speaking. It's not the only critical thing, but I think it's the one that's potentially the most overlooked. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you for a fascinating hour covering megacities. I think we have moved the football down the field and increased understanding of these elephants in the room, or the global stage, as it were. And we really, really appreciate your time and your expertise. Ladies and gentlemen in the audience, thank you for joining us. We'll look forward to seeing you in another webinar in the future. Stay safe out there. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Have a great
Thanks
day.
a lot.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Ted. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Take care.
Be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.